I've always considered myself a rational person. I don't scare easily, and I've certainly never believed in ghosts or monsters. So when I first heard a faint thump from the bedroom closet last Tuesday night, I did what any sensible adult would do. I blamed the house settling and went back to scrolling on my phone. It was past midnight. I was alone in a new rental house, and strange noises are practically a given in an unfamiliar place. Still, I'd be lying if I said I didn't double-check the closet door before turning out the light. It was firmly shut, and nothing seemed out of the ordinary. I told myself to stop being paranoid. After all, I wasn't a kid anymore, jumping at shadows and imagining monsters hiding behind my coats. The next morning, I noticed the closet door was open. Just a crack, but definitely open. I frowned, trying to recall if I had maybe gotten up in the night and forgotten, or if I left it. I jar by mistake. I was sure I had closed it, I always do. I have a habit of keeping closet doors shut, chalk it up to childhood superstition. Perhaps the latch didn't catch? The house is old. Maybe the door swings loose on its own. That seemed plausible enough. I shrugged it off, got ready for work, and made a mental note to check the door's hinges later. All day at the office, I couldn't quite shake a nagging feeling of unease. It was silly. Just a door that didn't stay closed. But each time, I absent-mindedly hung my jacket or heard the squeak of a cabinet. I flashed back to that closet door, open just a few inches, darkness spilling out from inside. By the time I got home that evening, I had laughed at myself for being so jumpy. To put my mind at ease, I examined the closet. It's a shallow space, just a rod with a few jackets and shirts, moving boxes I hadn't unpacked yet, and a shelf, up top. Nothing unusual. I tugged firmly on the door until I heard the latch click. There. If it opened again, I'd know something was off. That night, I was jolted awake by a soft scraping sound. I blinked in the darkness, heart thudding, and realized it was coming from the closet door, the door that was now sliding open very slowly. I could hear the wood dragging lightly against the frame. Through the growing gap, my eyes picked up the dim outline of my hanging clothes, and something else. Low to the ground, two pale shapes peeked out from below the hem of a long coat. They looked like shoes. Large, flat shoes. My breath caught in my throat. I fumbled for the bedside lamp and flicked it on, flooding the room with light. In that instant, the closet door stopped moving. I stared hard at the bottom of the closet. The shoes, if that's even what I saw, were gone. Only my brown leather boots lay on the floor where I left them. I must have still been half dreaming. Heart hammering, I forced myself out of bed and crept to the closet. I hesitated, then yanked the door open wide. Jackets swayed on their hangers, gently settling. Nothing else. I even pushed apart the hanging clothes, my hands trembling, to check the back corners. There was no one there. Of course there wasn't. Who would be in my closet at 3 a.m? I exhaled, shaky, but relieved. Maybe I imagined those shoes. The room had been nearly pitch black. My mind could have turned a crumpled blanket or a shadow into something more sinister. I reminded myself I'd been under a lot of stress with the move and a new job. Sleep deprivation can play tricks on you. To be safe, I wedged a chair under the closet doorknob before crawling back into bed. It felt a little ridiculous, like I was barricading against the boogeyman, but it gave me enough peace of mind to close my eyes. Eventually, I drifted off into a fitful sleep. In the morning, I awoke to a quiet house and the reassuring glow of daylight. For a moment, I almost laughed at my nighttime paranoia. But when I glanced over at the closet, my stomach flipped. The closet door stood wide open. The chair I had jammed under the knob was moved neatly aside, placed back against the wall. It was as if someone had deliberately removed the obstacle to open the door. My mouth went dry. This wasn't the wind or a loose latch or my imagination. Someone had been in my house. I spent the next hour methodically searching every inch of that closet and the rest of the house. Every cupboard, under the bed, behind the couch, anywhere a person, or thing, whispered a fearful voice in my head, might hide. I found nothing unusual, no sign of forced entry on doors or windows. Nothing was stolen. The only out-of-place thing was a faint smell in the closet, an oddly sweet scent like cotton candy or grease paint, the kind you might use for face makeup. By this point, my hands were shaking uncontrollably. I called my best friend Evan, whispering as if the intruder might still be around listening. He came right over. We both tried to make sense of it. A prank. But who would break into someone's house just to crack open a closet and not take anything? This, I've since realized, is always the best part. The beginning of the performance, when you can, if you try, lose yourself in the display and pretend everything is okay, that it's all normal. It was best on those lucky days when the performers on stage were completely unaware of just what sort of danger they were in. That always makes it easier for everybody. On that first day, I was as oblivious as they were and simply enjoyed the music. Maybe some snob of the orchestral arts would hear their amateurish mistakes, but to my untrained ear, they sounded just fine. Pleasant, even. But one question began to worm its way into my head. A small nagging at first, which crescendoed into a hammering on the inside of my skull. How much time has passed? At a certain point, I suspected the intermission was long overdue. But there were no windows, and I had to part with my electronic wristwatch at the door, so really, getting any sense of time was impossible. I dismissed it as my lousy attention span at first. But eventually others began taking notice. No one dared speak, but among the fellow newbies, I noticed furrowed brows and sideways glances, confused and concerned. The performers seemed to be getting restless as well, whispering and gesturing to each other and the conductor, who never ceased those robotic sweeping motions of his gloved hands. It must have been 2 hours by then, if I had to guess, and they were starting to look exhausted, dehydrated. Some even looked as if they were about to quit playing, continue performing. In a moment, all of the piano wire loudly reverberated and stretched taut with the movements of those mechanical contraptions on stage, as the whole thing bristled and tensed as though it were a living thing. And that voice, cracking like thunder, seemed to emerge from the stage itself with a mechanical roar like the grinding of metal on metal. That seemed to frighten them into submission for a while. It wasn't until a half hour later that my life changed irreparably. They'd been playing a quiet sonata, so everybody could hear the sudden fur-ting accompanied by a pained yelp. My eyes leapt to one of the violinists. One of her strings had broken and happened to snap her right in the eye. I could see the streak of scarlet bifurcate her pupil, before the emerging blood replaced the entire eye with a thick redness. She stood, clutching a hand over her eye and blindly grasping with the other, gesturing to medical help. And as she did so, that strange lattice of levers and hammers and pulleys all roared and clacked to life, like a bear trap being sprung. The machine's efficacy was just as sudden, just as brutal. Those clockwork edifices moved like a pair of robotic arms, aiming a wire for her neck as if trying to garrote her, but they moved at such a speed that the wire seemed to pass through her, like she wasn't even there. For a moment, she seemed fine, unaffected, as if nothing had happened at all. And then things began to fall off of her. Her head, severed at the neck, alongside the hand she'd been holding over her eye, and the very fingertips of her other hand with which she'd been grasping a little too high. All had been cut cleanly, with surgical precision. Time seemed to slow as they all went clattering wetly to the floor, and the girl's body soon followed, as if it took a few moments for gravity to set in. Or perhaps for her body to realize she was dead. It happened so fast it was hard to be properly horrified. It was more like awe, maybe. Everybody stared at the chunks of meat that had once been a promising young woman with hopes and dreams. That spiderweb of wires was still rumbling and shaking all around them, and the mechanical voice roared once more. "Continue performing." They were given no further warnings. A few of them jumped from their seats out of sheer instinct, not even thinking. None of them made it more than a step before the wires divided them in twain. The rest just kept playing exactly as they had been, as if their brain froze up at what they'd witnessed and simply ran on autopilot, until their faculties slowly returned to them and they realized that this instinct had saved their lives. Where once beauty filled the room, now the orchestra had been reduced to a discordant sound like a long, shuddering whine, like a mocking parody of music. They gripped their instruments with trembling, sweaty hands, playing just well enough to avoid, stoking the ire of those quivering wires stretched taut all around them. They realized, gradually, that they were allowed to speak. Immediately they began wailing hard enough almost to mercifully drown out that dismal cacophony that was once music. Some begging and pleading with the staff, others screaming out threats, be they legal or physical. Nothing they said could shake the masked men and women in the slightest. They stood at order like statues, unflinching. Realizing this, they turned their attention to us. A wall of red, weepy eyes scanning. The shot had come from one of the tragedians standing amid the upper gallery, I was certain. I almost made the mistake of looking back. Instead, I kept my eyes locked forward and merely imagined who it was that just had their brains splattered across their seat. Had they snuck a phone in and tried calling 911? Had they tried making a break for it? Or maybe they just couldn't take it anymore and made the fatal decision to look away from the horror. I tried to distract myself by studying the impossible mechanism animating the blood-soaked piano wire. I couldn't figure it out. It was an impossible machine, existing in defiance all basic laws of geometry, and seemed to have no means of controlling it, instead operating automatically with some malign intelligence. Perhaps it was an extension of whatever creature composed the stage itself. It was a living thing, of that much I was certain. It breathed beneath the performers, and their blood soaked into its floorboards in moments, as if consumed. After some hours, the orchestra had gone quiet, having screamed themselves hoarse. I couldn't imagine being in their shoes. Even just watching them perform was a test of endurance. Many of them were oozing blood all over their instruments from scarlet cuts where the skin had split. The woman on the French horn was struggling, hardest of all, her lungs and hands burning with exhaustion. "I can't," she eventually cried out in a hoarse little wheeze, horn slamming to the floor as her body gave out. "I'm so sorry, I can't do any—" A wire passed through flesh in an instant, and suddenly she had no mouth to speak, no eyes to see, no mind to think with. All of it lay splattered upon the stage, which sated itself upon that spilled. Fight. Another gunshot. I quivered in my seat, sweat beading on my forehead from the terror. Somebody in the audience had looked away, and I realized I had just been about to do the same thing, had the sudden sound not knocked me out of my stupor. Most of the performers went in similar ways over the next few hours, either making mistakes or their bodies giving out. As monstrous as it may sound, I was quietly praying for them to get it over with. They were dead the moment that they walked on stage. Why drag it out for all these hours, just for the inevitable to happen anyway? I recognize now that it's almost impossible to make that choice, to simply give in and accept death in defiance of all our natural instincts. But the auditorium now reeked from audience members voiding their bowels, and the damn woman next to me just wouldn't stop crying. Wouldn't stop at all. Vera and her husband lasted the longest of all, perhaps because they had each other. Over a dozen hours had passed, maybe even 2, and they were still playing a little duet in perfect sync, despite everything. By now, they were simply talking to each other as if nothing was wrong, as if we weren't even watched. "Baby, when we get out of here, I'm going to take you to Martha's Vineyard. I know I've been saying that for so long, but God, I wasted so much money on that stupid fucking motorcycle," he said. "Lucy's going to love it." Vera chuckled. "I don't know. It might be boring for a little girl, isn't it? All a bunch of old people up there?" He laughed weakly. "Oh, maybe in town. But you know her. Once you get her in the water, you can't get her back out. She's a natural-born swimmer, I swear. Think we'll see her in the Olympics some day?" Ha ha ha. It was surreal to watch, like I was peeking in on a private conversation a couple was having in their own home, but I could tell both of them were trying to maintain some illusion of normalcy. Anything to keep themselves psychologically intact as the hours pass. Even as they tried to smile and laugh, there was a quiver in their tone, a desperation, a fear of what might happen if there was a single break in the conversation. A lot of what they said was too personal to relay here. They went into old regrets, past mistakes, resolved every argument they ever had in all their years together. It was like they wanted to make sure they said everything they had to say before the end came. I think I owe them at least their privacy. But the husband was slowly deteriorating. He'd moved too quick, caught the symbol with his hand, leaving a wide gash along his palm that was gushing blood at a terrifying rate. Now he was getting woozier and woozier, swaying dizzily, his eyes unfocusing, his speech becoming slurred, and his playing sloppy. Vera desperately tried to keep him focused. "Talk to me, baby. Think of the beach. Lucy's going to love the seashells. She'll pick her favorite and put it on that little stand in her room with all her little trophies." She rambled on, but by the end, all he could manage was half-hearted grunts of affirmation. He was leaning in his seat, and then his drumstick went flying right out of his hand, sending a cloud of pink mist through the air along its path. And yet he kept going through. I'd never been explicitly told not to reveal what I'd seen there, and now I knew why. Nobody believed me. Or worse, maybe they were covering it up. I swear to God the police dispatcher laughed at me over the phone. I swore I'd never go back. I'd been part of something evil, something unfathomable, and it would haunt me forever. But the next year was one of constant desperation. Debt climbing as job opportunities declined at equal rates. I held out for about a year, but eventually I gave in. And to my horror, the next performance was easier now that I knew what to expect. And then the next was easier still, and the next. The performance is always different, but the end result is always the same. I have to remind myself that I'm not culpable for what they're doing there. All I do is watch. We watch people die every day in the news and online, people suffering horrible fates, often in places our own countries help to destabilize. How are my actions any different, really? We all have to accept that terrible things happen in this world, and all we can do about them is either look away or look the horror right in the eye. Is choosing to look away more moral, or is it only more cowardly? And besides, wouldn't it be worse for them if there wasn't an audience? If they had to die there in the dark alone? No one seeing, no one caring, no one remembering. After all, someone has to bear witness.